All right. So yeah, Prime Minister, whenever you're ready.
Wait, sorry, I need to drink water. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Lois. Pronouns are she, they. I'll take POIs through voice, please, but don't badger. I'll probably take you around 4 minutes or so. All right. 1, 2, 3. What do we have to establish for this debate? It is assumed by the motion that the state already provides subsidies towards these low-income families in these low socioeconomic areas to begin with. It means that the funds are still going to be provided for all of the people who are living in these areas. It's just that for well-performing children or for families with well-performing children, these families are given an additional form of cash payout or cash handout if their child reaches the standard of what an academically inclined child looks like. I'll talk about that more later. This means that other families will still be provided for. There is no lack of resources fiat by the motion. And then because the minimum will still be given to families as a base cash handout. When we talk about these are areas that are generally low in economic value. People are probably earning minimum wage. They probably rely on things like food stamps and government welfare and subsidies. There's probably lesser access to quality education, and there's probably not a lot of businesses to begin with in these areas that pay well, or there's not a lot of businesses that allow a generation of economic the generation of economic output because people don't have a lot of purchasing power to begin with. It means also that there's a lack of investment from the state from before. There's a lack of incentive from people to also continue like developing this particular area, right? They're just stuck there, they just want to survive. These cash handouts then therefore would be given out or be rolled out on a monthly basis, but the period of evaluation would be semestral based on like the school system of that particular area. Families would be given this particular cash handout whenever they do reach that standard. What then does this standard look like? So of course, a child's performance can be on the academic side or a non-academic achievement. On the academic side, there will probably be a standard grade that a child has to achieve and maintain. It doesn't have to be a 4.0 GPA. It doesn't have to be just the top 1 to 10 children in that school, but it's based on how well they are doing in their classes and how consistent they are. It's probably going to be a 3.5 and upwards GPA, right? So it basically doesn't necessarily rule out it doesn't mean that it's going to be cut out like if there's like 400 students who reach this, only 10 will get it. That's not how it works. It means that if you reach that standard, you'll get it no matter how many students do get that particular kind of grade. But it also extends to non-academic achievements, right? We assess how they are consistent they are with competing, with their achievements in sports, in debate, in art competitions, how many times you broke in a tournament. I think for this, there needs to be referrals as well from your professors or teachers because it is a much more subjective track. But essentially, the state has the ability and the resources to assess this with a panel of sorts, perhaps, or a panel of sorts, perhaps, that could essentially identify how good this child is performing in their school. But onto the two arguments that we're going to present. Number one, what exactly is the state's responsibility? What exactly is the state's responsibility in giving these additional cash handouts? But secondly, why is it much more effective, and what exactly would the cash handouts do for these families? But onto state responsibility. But before that, does anyone have a POI, preferably closing? Going
Yeah,
once,
so far it seems to suggest that your policy works basically by having unlimited money. What's the trade-off exactly that you're willing to make?
It's not unlimited money. Of course, we're not going to assume that every single child is going to be academically inclined, right? We're going to talk about what exactly these handouts are going to do. I'll talk about the trade-off later. But on to state responsibility. Number one, the state has failed these areas for the longest time because there has been no long-term solutions in these areas. This is not to say that the children are the only solution, but it is one of the ways in which the families could also cooperate with the state in terms of, number one, changing their behavior and priorities as a family, more on this later, but secondly, to alleviate their socioeconomic position. But Thirdly, we think that there is a high deprioritization of education in these areas simply because families do not see it as a form of investment, or they do not see the long-term rewards of education to begin with. And this is the problem. We need to combat that narrative that education doesn't do anything for them. And that is exactly why we're willing to give an additional benefit, an additional handout for these families who do prioritize education. We think the principle here states that that governments reward people who have the potential to give a return of investment for that particular government. We see that in how the state helps workers go abroad and give them opportunities so that the state benefits from taxes. We already see this when the state provides scholarship towards low-income people, provide funding to research for students who do well in school. Not just tuition fee, also uniform allowance, transportation, lodging, monthly stipends. The reason why the state does this is because of social contract, of course. But the problem is lower income people are always left behind. Richer people are always going to have better opportunities, better access to resources. The difference here is that we are now focusing largely on poorer areas, because now instead of having to compete with richer people in their areas, which is not an equal playing field, we make it and we bridge that gap, or we approximate that equal playing field. We know it's never going to be perfect, but at least there's a league now for the lower income areas to actually get that particular benefit on their end. So what exactly would the additional cash handouts do? The parents' first analysis here is that the opposition side can say that, oh, parents are going to exploit their child. Because in the majority of instances, parents already see their child as an investment. They already most likely force them to work, for example, or not even work, just take care of their siblings and have so many responsibilities as a child. That means that, given that this is the psyche of parents, why not use that psyche to make them think that education is the best way to actually, invest in your child, and not necessarily give them child labor, not necessarily make them just take care of their siblings without any form of long-term impact, long-term benefit for the child themselves. How then does this improve the quality of life and improve the relationships between the parent and the child? Number one, we talk about physical health, when they could use the money to feed themselves better. We can feed themselves better, get more quality things, for example, for their family. But secondly, on the educational aspect, they can actually have more investment as well for their child, and probably allow them to have a life outside of them just working and taking care of their siblings. Probably they could use this towards their education and invest in paraphernalia or things that they can use towards education that they couldn't have before. But thirdly, they could probably use this money to pay for transportation for their family, to go to their jobs, to actually earn money, to earn money in other areas outside of the low socio-economic area. But lastly, on emotional, right? Parents are likely to give them support and are unlikely to see them as burdens, given that they are going to provide money in the long term as well. Parents are more inclined to help them in their endeavors. Parents are less likely to exploit them, because now they see that investing in this long-term solution is good, that investing in this child's in this child's well-being is actually going to be beneficial for them, because they do get money. Even though that sounds selfish, we think it's much more likely to have a more holistic relationship within the family, because now they are less likely to see the child as a burden. Now it's an opportunity. We are very proud to propose. Thanks.
The House thanked the Prime Minister for the speech and call upon the Leader of Opposition. Here.
Okay, hi. So if you want to answer any POIs, please ask in the chat. Just give me 1 second to turn on my timer. If Gov decides to prioritize education through additional cash handouts, we think that the returns are most likely going to be, at best, very fickle or uncertain in the future, meaning that all the other opportunity costs that you've compromised as a result of this policy and this resource allocation is going to look terrible for these areas, meaning that you deprioritize a lot of important sectors at the cost of this motion. Firstly, just a few small responses. I don't think they can fiat in that they obviously have a lot of resources. I think resources are particularly limited in these areas because given that they're low socioeconomic performing areas, they probably get limited amount of budget allocated by the state or the central government to begin with. This means that right now they actually have prioritized some issues over the other, meaning that you can't just give a bunch of cash handouts, but as they say that they can easily give it to individuals and make it charitable towards people who even score 3.5. That's unlikely going to happen. Probably in their best case, they're still going to have varying degrees of amounts of handouts, meaning that you're probably not going to be able to reach out to a vast portion of children, given that in these areas they probably still have a large chunk of the population who is going to school, which means that you don't essentially get the huge amount of trickle down benefit that they actually talk about to that extent. The second thing is that I think given the fact that in these areas resources are particularly limited, you need to prioritize things that create much more important immediate benefits or much more holistic benefits that are more certain in nature. This looks like, for example, investing more towards vocational training, because even if you focus on literacy rates improving in these areas, you're probably never going to be able to compete with like massive industries in other urbanized areas anyway, which means that you want to focus more on your USP, like your agricultural sector or your particular resources that exist in your geographical area. This looks like areas in Khulna in Bangladesh where you can easily focus on like small things like or you can easily focus on the tea sector or resources that you currently have. I think that therefore this means that you're able to focus more on policies that are able to give you more certain benefits versus education that is more uncertain. The reason being is for a few things. The first is often good performance is inaccessible. And this is because of reasons like arbitrariness, which means that intelligence, because it is often innate in nature, or because it's based on like what biological like formulation created you, etc. It means that it's based on a lot of arbitrary factors to begin with. But it's also the case that because it's based on you having some privilege, like whether or not you can afford tutors or whether your parents can give you time, meaning that it's not going to be accessible towards a vast chunk of children in these areas. But it's also the case that even if they want to argue on the non-academic aspect, sports facilities and other facilities to pursue their arts and humanities passions, etc., are also unlikely to be there in these areas which already have limited facilities opportunities to begin with. So I don't really understand how they're going to create much more growth in these areas through skill development. I think relatively, at least if we focus on like skill development or like vocational training on the comparative, you can still achieve the same degree of benefits, but you can educate a bunch of your workforce to ensure that there is much more literacy rates and there's much more ability for you to have growth in these areas. The third thing to note here is that I think even if they want to argue that this creates an ability for these parents to actually have better relationships or send these kids to school, I want to argue that firstly, child labor is probably not a part of this debate because states have regulations to keep primary education mandatory in most areas, which means that it's unlikely that you will put your child through that. The second thing is parents also have incentives to actually improve the literacy of their own child because they rely on this child in the future for their own livelihoods, but also like they care about building safety nets and they understand the struggle that they have to go through in these areas, meaning that it's likely that they will still send their kids to school. So that is not a tipping point in this debate. And the next thing that I want to argue is on the basis of like intellectual labor and whether or not this is a fair metric. The first thing is performance, because it is extremely arbitrary in nature and very random based on like whether like your mental health condition or your like intelligence and your IQ, etc. It means that a lot of kids in particular will be unable to perform that well on tests to begin with, which means that they get blamed for putting their parents into the poverty cycle, meaning that you actually worsen the parent-child relationship in the long run, making it easier for these individuals to be stuck in a cycle of poverty, meaning that a lot of these individuals are not going to actually, this is not actually going to improve the relationship you have with your parents, but it's also going to create an unfair expectation upon the child in the long run. This is also principally unfair because one, I think governments are obligated towards providing for every individual, and if you push the burden upon these regular average students who probably might not essentially have interest or the ability to perform to that massive extent, it means that you instill expectations upon them, but it's also unfair to the extent that governments should be providing for you regardless. Before moving on, I will actually take a POI if anyone has any. All right, cool. Thirdly, just going on to the resource allocation argumentation. The reason why resource allocation is more important towards other sectors is because education, as I mentioned before, is unpredictable in terms of outcome. The reason being is that a lot of these children, even if you invest a massive amount of resources towards them, they're likely to like move away from these areas in the long run. The reason being is that these areas have limited career growth or living standards are very like minimal at best, and their wages are also probably not high to begin with. This means that if you want to work in more high growth sectors, you will move towards more like urbanized areas that offer you like better opportunities to begin with. This means that the brightest individuals in these areas do not have that obligation or won't actually feel as if or be incentivized towards living there in the long run, which means any return that you get in the future in terms of skill development or growth, etc., is going to be washed away or is uncertain at best. This also leads to the argumentation of brain drain, which eventually trickles down in these areas because you lose out on the cost of that investment made, but it also means that you don't essentially create a lot of growth. This is massive because in these areas, because you have a limited amount of money, you need to divest all of your resources towards returns that actually are likelier to happen well or likelier to actually accrue in the future. Given the fact that you prioritize these additional cash handouts on individuals whose incentives are wishy-washy, this means that you don't essentially create leaders or you don't actually create the whole tangible benefits that they want to accrue in the future. This means that therefore, relatively, it's more important to focus on other aspects like agricultural sectors, etc., that are much more important in these areas. And this is important because most of these areas have a large poor population, meaning that for them to accrue benefits or for them to accrue like jobs to begin with, you need to focus on things like vocational trainer that come at the cost of the limited budget issue that comes in this debate. The last thing is that even if they were to argue that a lot of these individuals are able to essentially like get better facilities, I want to argue that in these areas, given the fact that facilities are often still terrible, politicians are unlikely going to improve that in the long run. I think in the future, because the politicians don't have to care about these areas because they can keep promises and still get votes anyway, it means that they won't essentially focus on improving the education system overall on a holistic level. At least right now, when you have like some pushback, and this happens as a result of these areas being able to have like more holistic vocational training, being able to be educated on the ground, and you're not essentially focused on more privileged individuals, you have like better ability and better capacity to have more social development in the future. In general, intelligence is arbitrary, and it means that you create more societal obligations upon individuals who are the most poorest and are unable to access these benefits. Very proud to oppose.
The House thanked the Leader of Opposition for the speech and call upon the Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
Hi. Am I audible?
Yep, you are.
Okay, thank you. Wait lang, where's my timer? Wait. I'm sorry, wait. The keeper. There. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. It is an inherent human right for each and every one of us, for every one of us to be educated, as said in like the very constitution of human rights. And through this additional benefit, through this additional cash handouts, we tell you that we not only provide an education for them, but we also allow them to better their lives in the long run, even their educations in the long run. But then first, let's respond to like the very weird case coming from opening opposition, wherein firstly they said that kids are unable to perform that well, they get blamed, there's unfair expectations for them. But then even if this is true, this is an unimportant harm because one, the families will still get cash hands out to begin with, wherein they will still get their basic needs. Secondly, kids on both sides will be placed with unfair expectations. They are forced to work or help out the family and take care of siblings on your side. Ops world is much more harmful because the child is not taken care of, they don't develop skills, and they most likely don't learn anything. Compared to our side, where they're much more likely to be taken care of by their families because they are now the ones who are directly getting money. So very good examples of this is that there are people like who are there in poor families. Children are forced to look for scraps because they need the money, or children are forced to work on the farm as well. And parents keep on saying that you shouldn't go to school because there's no tangible benefit for you. There's money in the farm. Hence, we are able to get on our side of the house because with education, they're also gaining money as well. Additionally, we have to question their very idea of like we should focus more on infrastructure. When we have to know, in order to build buildings or create infrastructure, this still needs to take time. It still needs to take like 10 years or so. But then meaning they don't get an immediate benefit on their side anyways. But then we have to question then is who are likely the people who are going to work for these infrastructures or these developed sectors. When we tell you the people who are going to work for these sectors are the ones who are qualified. And who are the ones who are qualified? The ones who are qualified are the ones who are getting the education per se. And the ones who are capable of getting the education, since we are working like in a poor country in low socio-economic areas, the ones who are only capable of getting this are the people in the middle class or people in the rich. People who are rich. Meaning you don't necessarily help the poor people on the ground. You still leave them poor, you still leave them hungry, and only benefit those from the middle class, those who are already capable. And you hurt the most vulnerable actor on your side of the house. Hence, we have to question then is that why should we build education more than like infrastructure per se? When we tell you education is the most important, especially in these poor states, because it's the people who are educated, it's the people who are knowledgeable that are the ones who build this state, and the ones who can meaningfully provide and develop these sectors that they do so want at the end of the day. Where on our side of the house, we have people who know about math, who know about politics, and they actually care for the state more because they see that the state is the one who helped them become the person who they are. Hence, these are the times that when these people are able to meaningfully contribute towards the state. These are the people who want to help the state because the state helped them in the long run. But before I go on, I'll take that POI.
What happens to families that don't have children?
Well, they don't get the incentive. So I really don't get what you're trying to prove, because the only thing that we have to prove here is that how we're going to provide the education towards these children in the long run. Which leads me to my very main extension, is that how does this additional funding like incentivize a poor child to go to school? The only point that the child who belongs to a low socioeconomic bracket starts to care about education is that when they stop being hungry, is that when they stop caring about having to survive every day. Example, a child goes out his way to drop from school to sell scrap, beg, or even commit to a life of crime because there's money there and they can't see how practical school is. The only point that they see the relevance of school is that when it has a tangible direct effect towards your life, i.e. when you are fed, i.e. when you're able to buy new clothes, i.e. when you can see your life is improving, or i.e. when you're able to survive. And we do know that survival is what anyone wants. It's a basic instinct that we are instilled through our biology. This additional benefit is what allows us to consider education is important towards our survival. Meaning, in the choice between fighting for food, going through a life of crime, or selling for scraps, or studying in a safe environment, do note both of these have the benefit of you gaining money in the long run. The children are more likely to choose the safer environment because they have their instinct to survive. Hence, these people will want to go to school. They would want to study more. They want to be educated more because there are adults that shield them from harder, adults that give them guidance, counseling for their mental health, or even provide for their healthcare. Hence, we fulfill regardless of benefit, we still fulfill the state's responsibility to provide for their education. When given this additional money, children will want to study more. They would want to better themselves in education because this is what actually feeds them. Hence, we're able still to get more capable adults in the future who is going to build the state towards in the near future. When conversely, on opposition side, is that the opposite side, there's no opt-out. They can easily opt out of these things because they don't see the relevance of school. When I'm going hungry in school, I'd rather get scraps out there. I'd rather sell drugs out there because this is what gets me my food. When school isn't getting my food, I don't see its relevance. Right? It has a very big speculative benefit that they're saying that these adults are saying to me without necessarily providing to me in the immediate long run. So I'd rather go to these things than study. So then we have to question the very idea of exploitation, because exploitation is bound to exist on either side. Wherein there were very big claims on their side that the parents are going to be they're going to exploit them, that they're going to be abused anyways. When we tell you, even if there's exploitation on our side of the house, this form of exploitation is bound to be constructive and would allow them to opt out of these relationships. Because the exploitation, like through education, like their parents are forcing you to study, this actually gives you the skills necessary to become part of the workforce, to become self-sufficient, to allow you to disassociate yourselves from your family. When you have the knowledge of English, you have the knowledge of math, this would allow you to become an engineer, this would allow you to become an accountant, or maybe this would allow you to become a political science or be a politician in the near future that would allow to gain money. Hence, you're able to still benefit yourself. We're still able to benefit the children in the near future. When going on, then how do these children do more meaningfully contribute toward the state? So, given what I said earlier, given that these people know that the state actually helped in the long run because of their hard work, they know that the state actually gave much of it, that even in its very poor condition, they still help them out, even if the state can't afford it. So what they do is that instead of going through brain drain, leaving the country, they believe that the state can still be better because the state provided for them even when the state cannot. The state prioritized them when the state should be prioritizing another sector entirely. Hence, these people will give back. They would want to become engineers. They would build businesses. They would build businesses that would better their community, the communities that help them per se. And with all of that said and done, we proudly take this debate. Thank you.
The House thank the PM for that speech and call upon the DLO. Here.
Am I audible?
Yep.
All right. POIs via chat starting in 3, 2, 1, go. At this point in time, opening government has only one concrete benefit, which is that somehow they assume that the dropout rate will decrease as a result of this policy. I think you need to weigh out this benefit against all the harms we talked to about. Aliya gave you 3 specific ideas. The first of which was, we told you it was principally inconsistent, the point at which you do this, because the metrics to which you determine performance and progress are arbitrary in nature, and not everyone can perform to the same extent due to inherent things like biological factors and whatnot, not engaged to at all. Secondly, we told you how it would increase the amount of pressure on children to begin with, and lastly, we told you how it was an ineffective usage of resources. I think at that point in time, if you weigh out all these arguments compared to the one benefit, which is, oh, the dropout rate will increase, I don't think it really makes sense. Beyond that, we already told you things like primary education being mandatory for most places in general. So I don't really understand what the impact of their argumentation here is. However, what you do need to take into account is the first thing, which is that the budget that we have in this debate is probably not unlimited, right? I think Aliya talks to you about this a little bit. She says that, look, that where does this additional amount of money come from, right? Because opening government said that this money is not going to come out from the subsidy amount because they all are still getting subsidy. If it's not coming out from the subsidy amount, then we have to assume it's probably going to come out from the government's national allocation of budget for education, right? And I think at that point in time, it becomes very difficult for you to have long-term progress or long-term development in terms of education, because the way you're using these resources now is when someone performs well, you give them a lump sum amount of money, right? Which means if the total amount of budget for the government to put in the educational sector is $1,000, and you distribute that among 10 people, then the amount of money that each individual gets, I'm not sure in terms of what long-term investment they can make with that small amount of money, or whether or not it will be sustainable to begin with. But comparatively, if you use that $1,000 to perhaps build facilities or increase the pay of teachers, there is a substantiated and long-term growth that can actually benefit that particular community to begin with. Why is this important in this debate? This is important in this debate is because the places in which we are talking about are places where you don't have the schooling facilities to be really developed. You don't have teachers getting a lot of salaries. You don't have people there who are hired to be good teachers because they probably aren't being attracted by the salary range to begin with. At that point in time, no matter what you do, no matter how much you incentivize your parents to educate your children, those children are unlikely to get better education if the facilities in and of themselves or the ways in which they can become better students in and of itself does not exist. I think at that point in time, even if you agreed that the amount or the number of students going to the schools would increase, I still don't think it would eventually result in the outcome of students getting more education in general, because the quality of education does not improve comparatively in our world, which it does because you have a consolidated usage of the money that you have in your hand, as opposed to breaking it down into small amounts of money, which is not impactful to begin with. The second benefit that they have in this debate is by saying, oh, look, this amount of money will eventually be given by the parents back to those students and be reinvested in them for better food and whatnot. I don't think there is any guarantee that these parents are going to eventually pour this money back into the lives of these students. I don't think they can just assume this. But even if they want to make the assumption that now that these children are assets to the parents are likely to take care of it, I don't think this happens in real life. If this were the case, then everyone involved in child labor, those children would have the best life ever, because every child involved in child labor is an asset to the parent, but we still see these children suffering from malnutrition, them not being able to go to school and whatnot. And the literal impact of this is twofold. Number one, just because these children now make money for the family does not mean the family is likely going to take more care of them. But number two, given these are areas of high economic problems, just because that these children will be able to bring some money back from school due to their performance does not mean that the parents are going to go like, oh, these children don't need to work anymore. If anything, you need to engage with Aliya's analysis, where these children now will not only be pressured to perform better at school, where they will more likely fail because of the non-existence of the facilities, but at the same time, they will still probably be involved in a lot of things. Like if you're above the age of 18, these parents will push their like children to go off and find a job, but at the same time also perform well in colleges and universities and whatnot. I think then it becomes very difficult for these children, very difficult for these youngsters, the point at which they constantly need to perform at school or at universities, but at the same time also need to keep looking for jobs, because now they feel like it's on them to make sure that the family gets the extra amount of cash to begin with. But lastly, even if you agree to all of the things that opening governments says in terms of, oh, this like this amount of money is good because it will help in some type of holistic development of the children, but then they say, oh, the bar for reaching this the bar for reaching this amount of money is not going to be really high. It's going to be like CGPA 3.5 that is moderately accessible for everybody, and the teachers will have a say in it. Look, there are two impacts here. If the way in which you determine who gets the money is relatively accessible to everyone, then more people end up getting this extra amount of cash, and the amount of cash for each person decreases, which means the impact of that additional amount of cash is not very much so then, which means you don't get your big impact of dropouts decreasing. But if it is so that it's not that everyone is able to access it because the bar for getting this is not that high, that means the bar for getting the money is like actually going to be one where you need to have like things like home tutors and whatnot, which again fits into Aliya's argumentation of these being very arbitrary and inaccessible in nature, which means under no circumstances is this a fair way of giving out money to families to begin with. Before I move on, closing. Opening.
Judges do note that they live in a fantasy where suddenly when you better infrastructure, the students are suddenly going to be educated better. But then when you have students who don't want to study, who are going hungry, and these students would rather like go out and work rather than these things.
If the debate is about students who don't want to study, I don't see how in either world you change their lives, because in your world, those students don't want to study, they don't go to school. In our world, students don't want to study, but you force them to go to school, then they're like stuck on with doing things they don't want to do, and then they continuously fail at their education because they never wanted to take it in the first place. But more importantly, they would be going to school regardless because of laws and regulations of primary education and whatnot. The only difference is the amount of pressure you put on them in terms of how much they need to progress or what type of things that they need to achieve to be considered as a good child to begin with, right? I think lastly, what I want to talk to you about is this disproportionately increases the amount of pressure on women in general, which is why the POI was relevant, right? Because if there is a family that has no children, it means they don't get enough benefits, which means it becomes very, very difficult for the mothers, specifically the women, to either have more children so that they can have access to more amount of these additional subsidies, or be like the teachers, like, because if you cannot access teachers from outside, you usually like rely on the parents or on the mother to be the one who guides the students to begin with. The point at which the children are not going to perform well at school, or if one children does not perform well at school, you probably then put pressure on having more children to begin with, because you need the money to begin with. If that is the case, then it's going to be an unbelievably toxic environment for women in these sorts of societies to begin with. In conclusion, what have we proven to you? We've proven to you a few things. Number one, it's very arbitrary in nature and principally unjustified for you to do so. But secondly, if you do end up passing this policy, the amount of opportunity cost that you'll be facing is really, really bad, because it decreases the overall development of that particular society in terms of educational development. And lastly, we told you why these children are unlikely to succeed in these sorts of high pressurized situation. And even if they end up like going to school often, that comes at the cost of their mental health, because parents pressurize them to do both work and go to school to begin with, which is why we're very proud to propose.
The House thanked Nniel for that speech and call upon the member of government to begin the lower house debate. Here.
Hi, can you all hear me?
Yep.
All right, great. So POIs, please raise them verbally. I'll likely take one if nothing is raised before the 6th minute. And then secondly, just verbally interrupt me if my audio is being, choppy and unclear. I will just adjust my equipment. Right. That being said, let me just set my timer, then I'll begin shortly. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1, now. It is incredibly assertive for side opposition to say that change is unlikely without providing a comparative benefit on their end as well. I think they just try to find whatever is convenient in trying to put all the harms against side government without providing the tangible impacts on their end, why students are likely to be incentivized without the idea of the policy existing. It is actually in their world where more individuals are locked in a vicious cycle of poverty and less development. The second thing I want to say here is they said that children are always going to school anyways because that's the way laws mandated it to be. Well, I think this is an uncharitable characterization because this is not the vast majority of cases. If you look at places in the Philippines, look at places especially in Asia, not a lot of students go to school because they see chores and livelihoods. They see chores and livelihoods must be prioritized at the very end of the day because they have to go out to the fields, to vocational jobs, just so they can support having access to utilities, to water, etc. All of which are vital in terms of trying to find a quality of life that they're trying to juggle on top of already going to school in urban area, in less developed areas. I think they cannot just simply get away with this and assert their context is this thing. 3 things to this speech. Clarification, second framing, and the last is the argumentation. Clarifications, right? Let's try to look at the places to begin with, what low socioeconomic places look like, because I think this was not fleshed out fully in this debate, and this is completely important because it is fair to assume that there are schools that are existing, there are a lot of facilities that are existing insofar as water access, etc. But the main question here is, to what extent do these resources to what extent do these resources are available and all these things, and to what extent are they able to support the lives in low social economic areas? The second reason why we think that these places are less likely to receive development, because in status quo, there isn't a clear incentive for the state to support them to begin with. There's likely to be, less chances for you to gain visibility because the area is unattractive when you have low amounts of students attending schools, which means that the educational level or the competitive nature of these areas is likely to be less attractive to investors and less attractive to in creating facilities overall. The second thing we want to say is this debate happens to be at the age range of students ranging from grade students to high school level. This is important, and this is a clear context that we need to consider because it is a launching pad to their careers if they are able to have some level of educational attainment. But 3, we'd say that we need to use these resources coming from the state regardless of it being limited, because the state right now also realized that it further widens a gap if there's no incentive created by governments to begin with. Note that this is already them telling us that they're conscious and already cognizant of the state failure that they've done, and note that these individuals from these low socioeconomic places already feel left behind. That's why the incentive to improve themselves is likely to be low without external help. This is the way in which the state corrects their state failure to begin with, and why it's extremely important to have some level of intervention at the very end of the day. Second thing, framing. Why is it completely important to give it to the most performing student? 4 things under this. 1, these are investments placed in good faith, but despite the government running on limited resources. Second, this is a mechanism by which the child has the capacity to adhere to the demands of the contract or conditions, whatever the GPA status would be. 3, they have the highest chances of succeeding and doing well in a society because, again, it has to be in a world where you are making sure that your mechanisms are working and making sure that you maximize utility out of it. True, it is not the most equitable way because maybe grades are imperfect or measuring performance arbitrarily is not perfect, but it is the standard by which you can tangibly measure, especially in these types of areas. But the second thing is, why do not a lot of children choose to study in less developed areas? Aside from the reasons above, I think there are a lot of irreversible consequences of state failure that they can never fix if you don't have external intervention. What does this look like? Well, essentially letting them understand that the state has left them to begin with, letting them also understand that you have to live this life in order to survive and all these things that are making them stuck in the poverty cycle. But the main question of this debate is how do we get more students to attend and how do we provide the most amount of upliftment? The last thing I want to clarify in this framing is that parents are not always what they deem so as toxic. Oftentimes they come from humble backgrounds. They're doing their best to support their children, etc. What we want to forward in this debate are mainly two things. The first thing is to suggest why alternatives are never enough, but secondly, why pressure and the benefits of it is actually great in terms of launching these students towards their successful paths. POI, yes.
So you claim that the state has failed, and your solution is to make the kids in this failed system fight each other to see who survived the best in this failed system. Is that, do you think that's really equitable?
No. We already said it's an additional incentive. It does not mean you have to fight amongst your students or let them have competitive natures. It's just that an additional thing for them to be inspired. Why are alternatives not enough? One, scholarships and ample opportunities are unlikely to happen because they are city-centric, where private corporations want the most competitive students. This looks like their operations are very much tied to capitalistic structures, which let students perform tasks outside schools. But second, this also looks like representing themselves in competitions outside of their school activities, like the usage of talents in athleticism-based competitions, which is physically tiring already on top of school demands. But three, even if you get poverty-stricken individuals who get scholarships, there are big barriers by which you can never have the fullest benefits of this, because you have physical limitations, you have privileges. They still have to care about getting food or working outside schools where transportation is likely to be not that developed. But lastly, they can't necessarily go up the financial ladder easily, but still have to live up to the pressure. Second argument, why do we think that the pressure is important and why it's good? One, it's good because it exists regardless notice in the debate. But second, it prepares them for future employment or in higher educational institutions. Understand that this is about creating a strategic launching pad for them to increase the chances of social mobility. But second, this is habitual building. The earlier you prepare, the likelier are the chances of you being consistent in your performance. But three, it's just an extension by which states' values are being forwarded to families. What are the likely scenarios in this? One, students can finish their studies from grade 1 to high school. Two, the transition to higher education becomes easier and likely because of their educational attainment. Three, parents all the more support their children, and increasingly do so because there is not much more of a secure and promising future, right? All of these things does suggest why pressure is good, why regardless of you existing in a low socioeconomic area, you're likely to finish what you've started and make sure that these families get what they deserve, being uplifted from poverty without your proudly proposed things.
The House thanked the member of government for that speech and called upon the member of opposition here.
All right. Hi. Hello. Am I clearly audible? Can you hear me? Oh, cool. Awesome. Thanks, Zoe. POS in the chat. Preferred gender pronouns, I have none. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. This debate talks about low socioeconomic areas that have historically been disenfranchised. It is unclear how much money governments have access to in improving these areas. There's no fiat in this debate for unlimited cash to do everything else first, like giving everyone a lot of money, building infrastructure, and then still engaging in this policy, especially given that these are areas that definitionally have been less important to a government in the past. You can't fiat that governments suddenly treat these areas as the priority now and will give a lot of money to uplift these communities and these areas outside of this policy. The problem for OO then is that they said that the government has no money and then gave a policy that requires there to be a lot of money, building entire vocational schools, agricultural schools, paying every teacher $1,000 more, spending a lot of money on facilities for all schools. It is thus unclear the political capital for any of this exists, and so if it does, that's great for OO, but LO themselves claim that governments don't have that much money, which renders their entire counterfactual and consequently their entire case impactless. There's a few implications to this frame. The first is that trivially, the amount that you're going to give each family based on income level definitionally has to go down. OG and CG cannot defend a world where you give every family a basic handout, because money is being channeled away from basic welfare and towards this redistributive policy given limited resources. On our side, more money will go to people fairly based on income level, which means that more needs are being met for poorer people. But I acknowledge this is very super lame marginal debating, and I want to have a bit of fun. So I'm going to focus on two realistic counterfactuals, and I want to note at this point that both of these counterfactuals will use as little, if not less money than OG and CG will be using. First, OG's policy doesn't get more students to school. This will make us the only team to actually deal with OG, because OO only wanted to do trade-offs, and we will show that there are better ways to spend a limited pool of money in order to get children to go to school. So why don't people want to go to school? They need to work and they need to make money. That's a simple answer. Now, I want to point out here, OG is correct. Families are not stupid. They want their kids to get education, because education is the way out of the poverty cycle. Even poor families know this. It is not something that's unknown to them insofar as they know that education is the way to a better job or a better degree. But they also know that if the kid dies because they have no food, that is not a way out of the poverty cycle. Natural incentives therefore already exist to send the kid to school, which takes out CG, because CG suggests that there is no incentive for the kid to go to school in the first place. No. These incentives already exist. The problem, and OG already brought these incentives in. The problem is that for poorer families, the reason why people are being suddenly pulled out of school when they were initially going to school is because of sudden big costs that these poor people could not anticipate. And poor people have no safety net because they have no savings. So when there is a big medical cost, for instance, that need to be paid because somebody got cancer in your family, for instance, suddenly you need to work and your child needs to work to pay off that debt. Their model does not fix this for a few reasons. The first is that performance is not a guarantee, i.e., if a child is stressed out because their grandfather has cancer, for example, they won't be doing well in school anyway, and also, even if they are really good students, it is entirely possible that for that one test at the end of the semester, they're going to be doing badly, which means that families will never prioritize this as a way of definitively and definitely getting money, which is why you pull out your kid out of school anyway, even though there's a chance that they'll get a performance-based incentive. Second, this payment is delayed. It comes on a monthly basis, and because OG brought a policy that suggested at the end of every semester you'll get reassessed, this means that you might be pulled away, that income source can be pulled away for 3 whole months, assuming that a semester is 3 months, which means that this money is going to disappear from you in the immediate short term. Consequently, people who need cash the most still have no choice but to pull children out of school. And when they do that, when these students eventually go back because the debt is paid off, they cannot perform in school already and will lose out to more privileged kids in these areas, or just like the luckier kids in these areas who did not have the sudden problem of a sudden big cost forcing them out of school. Privilege is relative. If you were lucky enough to not have to pay for your grandfather's medical fees in that 1 year, you're going to get that benefit in the long term, because every single year you're going to be doing better than the kids who had to. So this is just a very bad way for keeping people in school. What should we spend that money on? Kids who drop out or suddenly go missing from school, what we ought to do is follow up on them specifically to alleviate the short-term debts of these kids who are forced to drop out, so that they go back to school instead. So instead of spending all that money on 100 different kids getting a 3.5 GPA, spend it on the one kid actually really needs a lot of money in order to go back to school. This is a direct solution to a direct problem, instead of wishy-washy nonsense to try and get the same outcome on OG and failing. Second extension, therefore, on clearing the bar. Again, I want you to remember that governments have a limited budget. So it's not realistic to expect that everyone can access that money even if everyone clears the bar. I.e., even if a lot of people get 3.5 GPA, you probably need to then adjust the bar higher because you have limited resources. Before I move on, anything from OG? Oh, yeah, OG.
Your metric is even more arbitrary if you just give money to everyone who drops out. What is the likelihood then of people actually wanting to put an effort if you just give them the money immediately?
But we're not giving them to everyone who drops out. We are going to go to their house and figure out what the situation is, and then figure out whether they deserve that money or not. This is like means testing. Is literally how things are done in the status quo. All right, moving on. So If lots of people get 3.5 GPA, you need to adjust it higher. Similarly, if many people fail to clear that bar, then no one gets help and kids still to get to have their school interrupted anyway. What this seems to suggest is that the bar will have to be constantly adjusted so that some people can clear it, but not everyone can clear it. All hints at this, but doesn't actually figure out the implication to why this is important. Here's the implication. It breeds unhealthy competition in an environment where what you actually need is cooperation. Right now, under their model, if you're in the percentile of students that is not getting that money, you want to beat the kids who are getting that money, and you can do that in a lot of different ways, including, for instance, like bullying them, putting them down, etc. In these low socio-economic areas, there's already a lot of problems that stem from a lack of cooperation. Because there is limited resources, there is a fight for resources. People turn inwards within these communities to fight for these limited resources. That's why there's gang warfare. That's why there's crime in these areas. Now you reinforce this mentality in school because you're basically saying that I need these resources. I'm going to fight other people in my school in order to get these resources. What you need instead is cooperation. People studying together, especially in a school that has limited resources and teachers. You need to be able to celebrate all success, right? And this looks like, for instance, if the school overall does well, the whole school gets a new library of free personal learning devices if the overall grades of the school improves, breeding cooperation and everyone improving instead of competition when you put other people down. That's a better model in order to achieve better grades for these students, and that is why we stand on CO.
The House thanked the member of opposition for that speech and call upon the government whip. Here.
Hi, am I audible and visible?
Yep.
All right. I'm Nniel, no preferred gender pronouns, POIs through voice. Now, please don't touch it. All right. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. Coming from CG, we believe that it is only just that the state extends additional assistance to families in poverty-stricken areas using a tangible standards, which might be arbitrary. I would go to that later, right? Such as grades in determining who gets this assistance, right? And I would first just to call out basically opposition, right? Like, to what extent can the entirety or a large chunk of a state's budget be refocused? Like, opening exchange, I think, dealt with whether the policy is feasible or whether the policy shifts the focus of policies addressing the needs of poverty-stricken areas. Like, I mean, can states focus on 2 or 3 things at once? Like, LGUs can both do 1, handing out additional assistance based on grades, or number 2, doing worker education campaigns in poverty-stricken areas, which I think already happens in status quo to an extent, right? The point is, to what extent can opposition's response to government's bench with regards to refocusing a state's priorities count? What are the structural reasons as to why a state can't focus on 2 or 3 things at once? There were answers though, right? Number 1, for them, for opposition, I think this was their attempt at answering that question. There was no incentive to better the state of education, right? We would have to question, what are the structural reasons as to why this is the case? Like, can politicians easily ignore issues just because the state has exerted a tiny bit of effort in improving an aspect of society? Like, what's the discussion in there, right? Deputy Leader of Opposition had a lot of answer to that question I posed earlier, right? They said that the allocation can come from education, and you could have allocated this budget on, more better, more direct benefits, right? Number 1, a lot of budget allocation allows for funds being allocated to addressing miscellaneous circumstances, right? But even if you wouldn't buy that panel, right? Even if, and this is number 2, even if, say, that money could have gone through better facilities or higher pay to teachers, these things does not still guarantee an overall better educational system. Like, the standard as to what amounts to better education consists of many different factors that are not contingent on money. Like, for example, the management of that particular school, or the how a curriculum is designed, or the motivation of students in a particular area. In our absolute worst case, and I think only CG is the only gov team to be brave on this particular aspect of the debate, right? We are okay with trading off, this is our absolute worst case. We're okay with trading off better facilities if it means a poverty-stricken family can possibly live their day-to-day lives a little bit more comfortably, right? So on to the comparisons. OG already largely dealt with why the state has a responsibility towards families in poverty-stricken areas, the social contract thingy, right? Do note, though, that this does not address why the additional assistance, considering that OG said that the state has already been providing assistance to these areas. Like, to what extent can we say that the state has adequately fulfilled its contract, right? In contrast, we told you how, even with the presence of current assistance, like absent government benches policy, which OG said in the initial parts of their speeches, families in poverty-stricken areas live day to day, even with scholarships in status quo, which opposition may argue as an alternative, right? The thing is, even with these things, they still live a hand-to-mouth existence. Poverty-stricken people still are plagued with problems of where can they get their rent or where they're going to get their dinner, right? Should the state be able to address these problems to even a tiny bit of an extent, then the state is on its way to fulfilling its end of the bargain, even if it cannot fulfill its end of the bargain to the fullest extent, right? I think it only exclusively came from ACG, right? OG also said that the policy changes the way families behave. To some extent, that's true. We need to combat the narrative that education cannot lift families out of poverty. What's lacking in these lines of reasonings are, number one, how does the policy change the way families behave? And number two, how does the policy combat the narrative? Like, does the narrative even exist in the first place? If it does, where does it come from, right? In contrast, we told you, regardless of a family's circumstances, at least on our side, we gave you reasons as to one, how these poverty-stricken families would benefit. Like, it's not as if they do not entirely believe that education will not lift them out of poverty. It's just that in their day-to-day existence, even with the alternatives you have in status quo right now, they're still there's a lot of problems plaguing them because of their socioeconomic status, right? Number two, at least the individuals benefit. Like, my member already discussed considering our worst case, that students are pressured, at least these students would be better equipped to handle whatever shit life throws at them in the future, right? Or at least their grades would be able to back them up to find opportunities in the future to lift themselves out of poverty, right? Going on to OO then, I think those lines of questioning already puts us ahead of OG. For OO then, they say OO said the policy is unjust because the policy is contingent on something that is arbitrary. Performance is arbitrary. But a lot of things are arbitrary, right? If government standard in giving out something is a numerical value that measures performance and argues it's arbitrary, then cash incentives that are contingent on excelling shouldn't be given out at all as well, right? Such as, for example, those who have given great research, right? After all, the factors behind all of these things are also arbitrary, right? Access to, connections, for example. So we would like to posit, is opposition okay with that as well? Because we don't think that's the case. This is just the consequence of, trying to tangibly measure something that has a lot of factors in it. Opposition also said that, students can get blamed by their parents. One, this seems intuitive, but why? Number two, parents who are bad parents and blame their children for not performing are symmetric regardless. With or without government's policy, parents with an inclination towards abuse would abuse their children, right? It's not as if the presence of additional cash assistance would make a meek parent become abusive. Opposition has to provide reasons for that. Because number three, what usually happens is a form of positive reinforcement. A student does well, great, we get money. If a student fails, a parent would probably be disappointed, but would not necessarily suddenly become abusive. Personality changes happen over increments. It doesn't necessarily change quickly, and opposition did give out responses to that. We painted the picture as to what happens exactly in poverty-stricken families in the first place, as what my member told you, right? CO comes in this debate saying that students fight among themselves. Number one, this is not going to happen. It's all about reaching a particular threshold and not about one-upping a particular student. Students don't fight each other for scholarship. Even if it does happen, what exactly are the harms, right? They say there's a sudden big CO says there's a sudden big cost as a response to the lack of natural incentive to go to school. It is a matter of extent. Families might want to send their children to school, but wouldn't it be better for them to at least be a bit more comfortable with our policy? Lastly, CO wants spend on that one kid who might have dropped out. Basically, they're waiting for students to actually reach that point in order for them to actually address that underlying problem, right? And besides that, already happens in status quo to an extent, like basically social work, right? And if their counterfactual is something more targeted, wouldn't this refocus the state's budget as well? Like that's micromanaging. Like how do you, for example, contact a particular problematic student, or how do you make them like assured, or like would they also like, you know, wouldn't they also fail if they think they can get money when dropping out, for example, right? Considering all of these reasons, I think it's a CG win. Yeah, thank you.
The House thanked the government whip and called upon the opposition whip. Here.
Am I clearly audible and visible?
Yep, you are.
Okay, thanks. Throughout the entire government whip speech, they have not dealt with the counterfactual that Deon has brought you, which is the fact that there are instances where like a family might have a like crisis, and they might have a like they might need money which is unanticipated, which is like some emergency medical bill that has to be dealt with like immediately. This is the reason why they must like drop their child out of school and force them to work, because of the fact that they have no other alternative, they have no other means of like paying for this bill rather than like they have no means of paying. That's why they have to force their child to go to work. So what is the counterfactual on our side? You have to recognize that on our side, what we would rather is that instead of giving everyone money, like giving 150 students money, we would rather focus on that one student that need this cash immediately because of the fact that like their family, there's this like cause of like they really need this money which is unanticipated. Like how will we implement this? It's very Deon already told you that there will be like social worker or like someone that will go to the family and ask for what's the situation at their house and know what is the root cause of them dropping their child off school. Like they have to like throughout this debate, you have to recognize that a lot of like families do see the value of school. Like they value education to begin with. There are two unique mechanisms to this. First, you have to recognize that education is the only means in which like a child might, like parents will want a better child, like they want their child to lead a better life. Therefore, they have this incentive to allow them to lead go to university or polytechnic at the very least, so that they can lead a better life because they will have a better job in the future. Like the unique reason of this is just because of the fact that they are able to lead a much better life and therefore do well in the future. Second, you have to recognize that kids are very likely going to be wary of one another because of the fact that like there's a lot of emphasis placed on the like there won't on our side, kids won't be wary of one another because there isn't that much emphasis placed on academic performance. It's very likely that kids on our side are able to hang out with like their classmates and not be wary that their classmate will overtake them and like be better than them, because you have to recognize that scholarships and whatever academic rewards is limited, and their family is their family will want them to like be able to get this like. If the family places so much emphasis on these academic scholarships, it's very likely the pressure will trickle down to all these like students, and therefore making them like more pressure to do well in schools, and therefore punishing them in the case that they don't do well. So what's the unique contribution of our case? Like Deon already told you how on our side we prevent the like unhealthy competition like from breeding, and therefore in schools we get more cooperation. Like the short-term impact of this is that you prevent the whole cohort or like the whole class from being so wary of one another, which is why you prevent things like gang from being formed, and second, prevent kids from bullying one another, which is so uniquely like detrimental to the kids who are not doing well, or like the kids who are doing well, therefore they are being targeted. Wait a moment. Yeah, I'll just take a POI now.
So why is it in your model that you must help the least committed?
It's not that we are trying to help. No, we need to help the least, like the family that's like in this crisis right now because of the fact that it's unanticipated, and because of the fact that like they might be facing an emergency medical crisis, like someone having cancer or some other medical conditions. That is why they need like that sum of money. Therefore, they force their child to go to work. Like the only way that we can solve that is to give that money right now so that they don't drop out of school and lag behind, like lag behind in terms of their academic, and therefore when in the future when like the crisis has been solved and like the money has been paid off, they cannot catch up because of the fact that they weren't in school for that period of time. So like back to the unique contribution of our case, you have to recognize that in the long run we help more students as compared to like all other houses in this debate. So recognize two layers of analysis. First, it's that we are able to get more like unity in the class and like in the whole school in itself. So this happens because it's very likely that kids on our side will make more friends as compared to others because of the fact that they want to do well, and they also will not like gatekeep materials or like resources that's so detrimental to the success of like these children because of the fact that they are required, like these materials are required for them to do well, like because of like they can study better and like do well in terms of academics. Hence, it's very likely that they will be more willing to help one another because of the fact that like someone who's smart might be friends with someone who is not as bright, and therefore like they will want to help them because they treat them as a friend and not as an enemy. So like the second unique reason is that you recognize that we allow these kids to form a good support structure that can allow them to like progress together, which allows the entire like environment to do well, and therefore you don't get like the disparity that in the worst case, in the best case of like government that exists. Like in government's best case scenario, what happens is there's a disparity between those who are doing well and those who are not doing well. On our side, because of the fact that everyone know each other and everyone has that added incentive to like do well together, it's very likely that those who are smart will help the rest and therefore prevent disparity from happening, and everyone can progress together, allowing everyone to succeed in the long run. Why is this so important? Because you have to recognize that like how the opening has already characterized this entire debate. You have to recognize that the state don't really have that much funding to give these schools to start with, and therefore you cannot have this disparity because some kids are going to lose out, and it's bad for these kids to lose out because they lose out on job opportunities, which makes their life even better, better in the long run. So therefore we are better in ensuring like these children will be able to grow up properly and like they are able to lead a more meaningful life in the long run. And like the second unique reason of this is that they are able to they are able to not be so stressed from school because of the fact that they are not going to be like bullied by their classmates or like being threatened by them because of the fact that they are doing well. So next onto like the onto some rebuttals. Like so CG didn't actually bring up any policy or like how they are going to solve this. They just said that like some kids are not going to go to school, and therefore they are going to like this will help them like force them to go to school or like be an incentive to go to school. They fail to recognize that kids, like parents, actually have the incentive to send their child to school. Like I already told you that parents know that the only way in which their child can succeed is through education. They see like, and second, they see other people from urban areas coming back like to the rural areas to see their families or whatnot, and they see them like earning so much money. They envy, and therefore they know that the only way in which they can succeed is for their child to get education. Like they have to recognize this fact. Therefore, like there's that incentive. Parents already have that incentive to send their child to school. And we also told you on how like the only reason, like the most unique reason, and why the only reason why we take this debate is because of the fact that like you have to recognize that families will face like crises which are not anticipated, like some medical crisis, for example. And when that happens, parents have no choice. And because they have no choice, they will pull their child out of school, and their child will lag like in terms of progress, and therefore that is detrimental for them in the long run. On our side, we solve that because of the fact that on our side, when we give this give these families the cash upfront, like because of the fact that they are facing this crisis, we prevent that from happening. Their child don't lag behind others, and therefore like they are able to succeed and therefore get education and therefore succeed. And with that, how to oppose?
The House thanked the opposition whip for their speech and invite all speakers to cross the floor and shake hands. Speakers can also exit the breakout rooms while the judges deliberate, and we'll call you back in when we are ready.